My name is Clara Sutton, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about workplace justice. Have you ever begged for one moment of humanity from your boss, only to have them laugh in your face? When my manager sneered at my dying father's last breath, he signed his own downfall. What I uncovered about Dad's hidden life, and what I did when I returned to work, will make you question who's really in control at the office and how far you'd go to get justice. The fluorescent lights in the break room of Maple Grove Diner buzzed overhead like angry wasps as I knelt before Mitchell Crane's desk, my hands shaking as I clutched my phone. The screen still displayed the call from Mercy General Hospital. The words, "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and maybe days," echoing in my mind like a death knell. "Please, Mr. Crane," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the ancient refrigerator. "It's my father. The doctors say he doesn't have long. I just need a week. Maybe less. I've never asked for anything like this before." Mitchell Crane looked up from his greasy paperwork, his thin lips curling into what could charitably be called a smile but looked more like a sneer. At 45, he had the kind of face that suggested he'd been born middle-aged and bitter, with receding hair that he combed over with the desperation of a man clinging to his last shred of dignity. His polyester manager's shirt was stained with coffee and what looked like maple syrup, and his breath smelled of cheap cigarettes and cheaper cologne. "Emergency leave?" He leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning under his weight. "Clara, sweetie, who's going to cover your tables if you just disappear? The breakfast rush doesn't stop because your old man's feeling under the weather." "Under the weather?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Mr. Crane, he's dying." The oncologist said, "Look, I get it, family drama and all that." He waved his hand dismissively, as if my father's impending death was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "But I've got a business to run here. You signed a contract when you started working here 2 years ago. That contract doesn't have a clause for personal problems." I felt something cold settle in my chest, a numbness that had nothing to do with the broken air conditioning. Personal problems? My father is dying. And that's tragic. Really, it is. His voice carried all the sincerity of a used car salesman trying to sell a lemon. "But Maple Grove Diner serves 300 customers a day. Your section alone handles about 60 of those. You think I can just pull a replacement waitress out of thin air?" The break room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in around me. I could hear the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the distant murmur of customers, the everyday sounds of a world that was continuing to spin while mine was falling apart. "I'll work extra shifts when I get back," I said, hating how desperate I sounded. "Double shifts, whatever you need. I'll make up the hours." "Clara, Clara, Clara." He shook his head like I was a child asking for candy before dinner. "You're thinking with your heart, not your head. What happens when every employee starts asking for time off because their family members get sick? Where does it end?" "It ends with basic human decency," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. His expression hardened. "Human decency doesn't pay the bills, sweetheart. And it doesn't keep this place running. You want time off? You've got vacation days. Use those." "I only have 3 days left for the entire year." "Then you should have managed them better." He turned back to his paperwork, a clear dismissal. "Besides, it's not like you can do anything for him anyway. Hospitals have doctors for a reason." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there for a moment, my coffee-stained apron suddenly feeling like a straitjacket, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in a sickly, yellow glow. In that moment, I understood something fundamental about Mitchell Crane. He wasn't just a bad boss. He was a man who had never loved anyone enough to understand what I was going through. "So that's it?" I asked. "That's your final answer?" "That's my final answer." He didn't even look up. "You can take your 3 vacation days if you want, but after that, you're either here or you're looking for another job. And good luck finding one that pays as well as this one." I turned and walked out of that break room, my legs moving automatically while my mind reeled. The main dining area of Maple Grove Diner stretched before me, all cracked vinyl booths and sticky tables. the smell of bacon grease and disappointment hanging in the air like a fog. This place had been my life for 2 years, the job that paid my rent and kept food on my table while I figured out what to do with my life. Now it felt like a prison. The customers looked up at me with the casual indifference of people who saw waitresses as part of the furniture, interchangeable and easily replaced. Mrs. Henderson in booth 3 was complaining about her eggs being too runny, while the businessman in booth 7 was already snapping his fingers for more coffee. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that my world had just imploded. I untied my apron with trembling fingers, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Then I walked out of Maple Grove Diner, leaving behind the job I needed but could no longer bear to keep. At least not for the next few days. The drive to Mercy General Hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-formed thoughts. My 2015 Honda Civic, with its cracked windshield and rattling exhaust, felt like a time machine carrying me toward a future I wasn't ready to face. Dad had been sick for months, but the doctors had been optimistic. Stage 2. They'd said, treatable, manageable. The word cure had been whispered like a prayer. But cancer doesn't care about prayers or optimism or the fact that Arthur Sutton was only 58 years old and had plans to see his daughter graduate from college someday. I found him in room 314, looking smaller than I remembered. Dad had always been a big man. Not tall, but solid. With hands that could fix anything and a laugh that could fill a room. Now he seemed to have shrunk into the hospital bed, his skin pale and papery, his breathing shallow and labored. "Clara, honey." His voice was barely a whisper. "You didn't have to come. Shouldn't you be at work?" "I'm exactly where I need to be," I said, taking his hand in mine. It felt so fragile, like I might break it just by holding on too tight. "I don't want you to get in trouble on my account. Dad, don't worry about work. Just focus on getting better." He smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that said he knew things I didn't want to acknowledge. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you. About my work. About what I really do. You're an accountant for Henderson and Associates." "I am an accountant," he said slowly. "But not the kind you think. I work for the federal government, honey. I'm what they call a forensic accountant. I investigate financial crimes, money laundering, tax evasion, the kind of work that makes enemies." I stared at him, trying to process this information. "What are you talking about?" "I've been working undercover for the past 3 years, investigating a company called Harborfield Hospitality Group. They own restaurant chains, hotels, catering companies. On paper, they look legitimate. But they're washing money through their businesses, skimming from employee wages, evading taxes on a massive scale." "Dad, you're scaring me." "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I've been gathering evidence, building a case, but I'm running out of time, and the investigation isn't complete. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you. Clara, listen to me." His grip on my hand tightened with surprising strength. "If something happens to me, you need to know where I've hidden the evidence. It's in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. The key is in my desk at home, taped under the bottom drawer." "Dad, stop talking like this." "The box number is 1247. Inside, you'll find a USB drive with encrypted files. The password is your mother's maiden name and the year we were married. Promise me you'll get it to Agent Calloway at the Federal Revenue Bureau if anything happens." I promised, even though I didn't want to think about a world where I'd need to keep that promise. Dad held on for 3 more days. 3 days of sitting by his bedside, watching him fade away like a photograph left too long in the sun. 3 days of learning about the man I thought I knew. Discovering that my quiet, methodical father had been living a double life as a federal investigator. On the morning of the 3rd day, he squeezed my hand one last time and whispered, "I'm proud of you, honey. You're stronger than you know." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in a sterile hospital room with nothing but questions and the weight of a promise I'd never wanted to make. The funeral was small, held at Morrison's funeral home on a gray Tuesday morning that matched my mood perfectly. I'd expected maybe a dozen people, the handful of neighbors who knew Dad and a few colleagues from his supposed accounting firm. Instead, nearly 50 people showed up, most of them strangers to me. They were an odd assortment of mourners. There was Mrs. Peterson from next door, clutching a casserole dish and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. There were a few men in cheap suits who looked like they might have worked in an office somewhere. But there were also people who didn't fit the profile of accountant colleagues. 3 men in expensive suits stood at the back of the chapel, their faces impassive as they watched the proceedings. They didn't approach me during the receiving line, didn't offer condolences or share memories of Dad. They simply observed, like they were taking notes for a report. After the service, as I was accepting final condolences and trying to figure out how to navigate a world without my father, one of the men in suits approached me. He was tall and thin, with graying hair and the kind of face that revealed nothing about what he was thinking. "Miss Sutton," he said, extending his hand. "Agent Calloway, Federal Revenue Bureau. I worked with your father." So it was true. Dad really had been living a double life. "I'm sorry for your loss," Calloway continued. "Arthur was a good man and a dedicated investigator. His work will not be forgotten." "Thank you," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. "I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you about your father's investigation. Did he leave any materials, files, documents, anything that might help us complete his work?" I thought about the safety deposit box, the USB drive, the promise I'd made to a dying man. "I don't know. I haven't had time to go through his things." "Of course, take your time. But if you find anything at all, please contact me immediately." He pressed a business card into my hand. "This investigation is critical, Miss Sutton. The people your father was investigating are dangerous, and they won't hesitate to cover their tracks." I looked at the card, noting the official seal and the phone number. What exactly was he investigating? Financial crimes on a massive scale, money laundering, tax evasion, employee exploitation, the kind of crimes that hurt ordinary people while making rich people richer. He glanced around the funeral home, as if checking to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Your father was close to exposing something big, something that could take down an entire network of corrupt businesses. And now? Now we're starting over without our best investigator." He paused, studying my face. "Unless you'd be willing to help us complete his work." The request hung in the air between us like a challenge. I was 28 years old, a college dropout working as a waitress in a family diner. And this federal agent was asking me to step into my father's shoes as an undercover investigator. "I wouldn't know where to start," I said. "You'd be surprised what you're capable of," Calloway replied. "Your father spoke about you often. He said you had his eye for detail and his stubborn streak. That's a powerful combination in this line of work." After the funeral, I drove home to Dad's small apartment on the outskirts of Riverton, a place I'd visited countless times but never really examined. Now I was seeing it through new eyes, looking for signs of the secret life he'd been living. The apartment was exactly as I remembered it. Modest furniture, a few family photos, shelves lined with books about accounting and finance. But when I started looking closer, I began to notice things I'd missed before. The desk in his bedroom had a false bottom in the bottom drawer, just like he'd said. The key to the safety deposit box was there, along with a stack of what looked like coded notes. I spent the next day at the bank, my hands shaking as I opened safety deposit box 1247. Inside was a USB drive, exactly as Dad had promised, along with a letter addressed to me. "Clara." The letter began in Dad's careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're probably feeling lost and angry. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth while I was alive, but I hope you'll understand why I had to keep this secret." The USB drive contains 3 years of evidence against Harborfield Hospitality Group and their network of shell companies, financial records, recorded conversations, documented instances of wage theft and tax evasion. It's enough to bring down the entire organization, but only if it reaches the right people. I know this is a lot to ask, but I need you to be careful who you trust. There are people in law enforcement who are on Harborfield's payroll. People who would love to see this evidence disappear. Agent Calloway is one of the good ones, but even he has limitations. If you decide to pursue this, remember that you're not just doing it for me or for justice. You're doing it for every employee who's been cheated out of their wages, every family who's been exploited by a system that values profit over people. I love you, honey. Be careful, be smart, and trust your instincts. Dad! I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, holding the USB drive and feeling the weight of my father's legacy. He'd spent 3 years building a case against criminals who hid behind corporate structures and legal loopholes. Now it was up to me to decide what to do with that work. The smart thing would have been to hand everything over to Agent Calloway and walk away. Let the federal government handle the investigation. Let the courts sort out justice. Let someone else worry about the consequences. But I kept thinking about Mitchell Crane's words. Personal problems don't pay the bills. I thought about the callousness in his voice, the way he dismissed my father's death as an inconvenience. And I realized that Mitchell Crane was exactly the kind of person my father had been investigating. A small-time tyrant who exploited workers because he could. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of turning the evidence over to Agent Calloway, I was going to use it myself. I was going to finish what Dad started, but I was going to do it my way. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop that night and spent hours decrypting the files using my mother's maiden name and my parents' wedding year. What I found made my blood run cold. Harborfield Hospitality Group wasn't just a restaurant chain. It was a massive money laundering operation that used legitimate businesses to wash cash from drug sales, human trafficking, and other criminal enterprises. They had over 200 locations across the country, each one skimming money from employees and customers while reporting false revenue to the IRS. And there, buried in the financial records, was a familiar name, Maple Grove Diner. The diner where I'd worked for 2 years, where Mitchell Crane had laughed at my father's death, was part of Harborfield's network. Every tip that had been skimmed, every overtime hour that had been denied, every benefit that had been cut was part of a larger criminal conspiracy. I realized then that my father's investigation and my own workplace humiliation were connected in ways I'd never imagined. Mitchell Crane wasn't just a bad boss. He was a criminal who had been stealing from his employees for years. The next morning, I drove back to Maple Grove Diner for the first time since Dad had died. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the morning shift employees. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the building that had been my workplace for 2 years, seeing it now through different eyes. Mitchell Crane was inside, probably sitting at his desk in the break room, counting money and making plans to exploit his workers. He thought he was safe, protected by corporate structures and legal technicalities. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. I walked into the diner and found Crane exactly where I'd expected him to be, hunched over a stack of paperwork with a calculator in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He looked up when I entered, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. Well, he said, not bothering to put out his cigarette. Look who decided to come back. I figured you'd found another job by now. I need to talk to you about my father's death, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Your father? He laughed, a harsh sound that made my skin crawl. What about him? He's dead, right? That's what you said. He was investigating Harborfield Hospitality Group when he died. The change in Crane's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The casual arrogance disappeared, replaced by something harder and more alert. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of one of the financial documents from Dad's USB drive. Arthur Sutton, forensic accountant with the Federal Revenue Bureau. 3 years of investigation into Harborfield's money laundering operation. Crane's face went pale. You don't know what you're messing with, little girl. I know enough. I put my phone away and looked around the break room, seeing it now as the crime scene it was. I know that you've been skimming tips from the waitstaff. I know that you've been falsifying time cards to avoid paying overtime. I know that you've been routing money through shell companies to avoid taxes. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. My father was very thorough in his investigation. He documented everything, recorded conversations, photographed documents. He built an airtight case against Harborfield and everyone who works for them. "So what do you want?" Crane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want justice," I said. "But not the kind you think." I left the diner without another word, leaving Mitchell Crane to wonder what I was planning. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure myself. I had the evidence to destroy Harborfield and everyone connected to it. But I wanted to do more than just hand it over to the federal government. I wanted to make sure that the people who had been hurt by their crimes received justice as well. That's when I decided to contact Riverside Dining Group, Harborfield's biggest competitor. I'd done some research and discovered that Riverside had been trying to buy out Harborfield for years, but had been blocked by what they assumed was superior business practices. If they knew the truth about Harborfield's criminal operations, they might be willing to pay handsomely for the evidence that would bring down their competition. I made an appointment to meet with Sylvia Knox, Riverside's Director of Strategic Acquisitions, at her office in downtown Riverton. Knox was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of sharp business suit that suggested she ate corporate rivals for breakfast. "Miss Sutton," she said as I sat down across from her desk, "I understand you have information about Harborfield Hospitality Group that might be of interest to us." "I have evidence that Harborfield is engaged in massive financial fraud," I said, getting straight to the point. "Money laundering, tax evasion, employee exploitation, the kind of evidence that would shut them down permanently." Knox leaned back in her chair, studying me with intelligent eyes. "That's a serious accusation. What kind of evidence are we talking about?" I pulled out a folder containing printed copies of some of Dad's financial documents, carefully selected to show the scope of Harborfield's crimes without revealing the most sensitive information. Knox read through them carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "If this is accurate, Harborfield has been defrauding the government and their employees for years." "It's accurate," I assured her. "My father spent 3 years building this case before he died." "And you're willing to turn this evidence over to us?" "For the right price." Knox smiled, and I could see she was reassessing me. "What did you have in mind?" "I want Riverside to acquire Harborfield's assets after they're shut down," I said. "I want guarantees that the employees will be treated fairly, with proper wages and benefits. And I want a consulting fee for my services." "How much of a consulting fee?" $2 million. Knox didn't blink. "That's a significant sum for a waitress." "I'm not just a waitress," I said. "I'm the daughter of a federal investigator, and I have access to evidence that could save Riverside millions of dollars in acquisition costs while destroying your biggest competitor." We negotiated for 2 hours, with Knox's lawyers joining the meeting to review the legal implications of what I was proposing. In the end, we reached an agreement. Riverside would pay me $2 million for the evidence against Harborfield, with the understanding that they would use it to acquire Harborfield's assets after the company was dissolved. The money would be placed in an escrow account to be released after Harborfield's conviction and asset forfeiture. In addition, Riverside agreed to hire all of Harborfield's employees at fair wages and provide them with proper benefits and working conditions. It was a complex arrangement, but it accomplished what I wanted: justice for the employees who had been exploited, punishment for the criminals who had hurt them, and financial security for me. The next step was contacting Agent Calloway and providing him with the evidence he needed to build a case against Harborfield. I met him at a coffee shop downtown, sliding a copy of the USB drive across the table along with a detailed summary of what Dad had discovered. "This is incredible," Calloway said as he reviewed the documents. "Your father really was close to exposing the entire operation." "Close enough," I said. "What happens now?" "Now we build a case and start making arrests. This evidence is enough to get search warrants for Harborfield's offices and financial records. We'll freeze their assets, shut down their operations, and prosecute everyone involved." "Including Mitchell Crane?" "Especially Mitchell Crane. From what I can see here, he was one of their key operatives, handling the day-to-day money laundering operations at the restaurant level. I felt a warm satisfaction at those words. Mitchell Crane was going to pay for his crimes, and not just the financial ones. He was going to pay for the cruelty he'd shown to me and every other employee who had asked for basic human dignity. The arrests began 3 weeks later. I was at home, watching the morning news, when I saw federal agents leading Mitchell Crane out of Maple Grove Diner in handcuffs. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of his situation. The arrogant manager who had laughed at my father's death was gone, replaced by a frightened man who finally understood the consequences of his actions. The news report showed agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the diner, sealing off the building with yellow tape. The reporter explained that Harborfield Hospitality Group was being investigated for financial crimes, and that over 50 people had been arrested in a coordinated raid across multiple states. I turned off the television and sat in silence, thinking about my father and the work he'd done to make this moment possible. He'd spent the last 3 years of his life building a case against criminals who thought they were untouchable, and now they were facing justice. But I also thought about the future. Riverside Dining Group would soon take over Harborfield's assets, and the employees who had been exploited would finally receive fair treatment. The $2 million I'd earned would allow me to start a new life, maybe go back to school, maybe start a business of my own. Most importantly, I'd learned something about myself during this process. I'd discovered that I was indeed my father's daughter, with his eye for detail and his stubborn streak. I'd also discovered that I was capable of much more than I'd ever imagined. A few days later, I received a call from Agent Calloway. "Miss Sutton," he said, "I wanted to update you on the case. Mitchell Crane has agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's providing information about Harborfield's operations and identifying other participants in the money laundering scheme." "What kind of sentence is he looking at?" "With cooperation, probably 8 to 10 years in federal prison. Without cooperation, he could have faced 20 to life." I thought about that for a moment. 8 to 10 years seemed like appropriate punishment for someone who had stolen from his employees and shown such callous disregard for human suffering. It wasn't the kind of dramatic revenge you see in movies, but it was real justice. "There's something else," Calloway continued. "We've been so impressed with your work on this case that we'd like to offer you a position with the Federal Revenue Bureau. You have the skills and instincts for this kind of work, and we could use someone with your particular talents." I was tempted by the offer. There was something appealing about the idea of following in my father's footsteps, using my skills to fight financial crime and protect ordinary people from exploitation. But I also knew that I had other plans. "Thank you for the offer," I said, "but I have something else in mind." 6 months later, I used part of my settlement money to establish the Sutton Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting workers' rights in the restaurant and hospitality industry. We provide legal assistance to employees who have been exploited, investigate wage theft and other workplace violations, and work to hold employers accountable for their actions. The organization was inspired by my father's work, but it operates differently than a federal investigation. We focus on education and prevention, helping workers understand their rights and providing them with the tools they need to protect themselves. We also work closely with law enforcement when we uncover criminal activity. But our primary mission is to prevent exploitation before it happens. We've helped hundreds of workers recover stolen wages, and we've forced dozens of employers to change their practices. I think Dad would have been proud of what I've accomplished. I've taken his work and expanded it, creating something that helps people in ways that a traditional law enforcement investigation never could. Mitchell Crane was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 6 years, assuming he continues to cooperate with ongoing investigations. The other Harborfield executives receive sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement in the criminal conspiracy. Riverside Dining Group successfully acquired Harborfield's assets and has kept their promise to treat employees fairly. The former Maple Grove Diner is now a Riverside family restaurant, with better wages, full benefits, and management that actually respects its workers. I drive by the old diner sometimes, just to see how it's changed. The building looks the same from the outside, but I know that everything inside is different. The employees smile more, the atmosphere is warmer, and no one has to beg for time off to be with their dying parent. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just accepted Mitchell Crane's refusal and found another job. Would Dad's investigation have died with him? Would the employees of Harborfield's restaurants still be getting exploited? Would Mitchell Crane still be sitting in that break room, counting stolen money and treating his workers like disposable objects? I'll never know the answers to those questions. But I know that I made the right choice. I honored my father's memory by finishing the work he started, and I used that work to create something bigger than either of us could have accomplished alone. The Sutton Initiative has grown beyond what I originally envisioned. We now have offices in 12 states and a staff of 43 people, including lawyers, investigators, and social workers. We've recovered over $8 million in stolen wages and have helped pass legislation that strengthens worker protections in the hospitality industry. But more than that, we've changed the culture of the industry. Employers know that we're watching, that we're ready to investigate and prosecute when workers are exploited. They know that the days of treating employees as disposable are over. I still think about my father every day, and I still miss him terribly. But I also know that his work lives on through the Sutton Initiative and through the lives of the workers we've helped. He spent his life fighting for justice, and now I'm doing the same thing. Sometimes justice comes through the courts, with handcuffs and prison sentences. Sometimes it comes through legislation and policy changes, and sometimes it comes through the simple act of treating people with the dignity and respect they deserve. Mitchell Crane learned that lesson the hard way, and I'm glad I was the one to teach it to him. He thought he could treat people like objects, that he could laugh at human suffering without consequences. He was wrong. In the end, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about creating a world where people like Mitchell Crane can't get away with their cruelty, where workers have the power to protect themselves, and where human dignity is valued above profit margins. That's the world my father fought for. And it's the world I'm still fighting for today. And every time I help a worker recover stolen wages or force an employer to change their practices, I know that Dad's work continues. The Sutton Initiative isn't just a nonprofit organization, it's a legacy, a promise, and a warning to anyone who thinks they can exploit workers without consequences. We're watching, we're ready, and we're not going away. That's the real revenge, not just punishing the people who hurt us, but building something better in their place. Mitchell Crane got his prison sentence, but the workers of America got something much more valuable. They got hope. And in the end, that's what matters most.